The hotel ballroom was alive with the hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and the soft sound of jazz emanating from the stage. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the luxurious venue, where corporate professionals mingled, networked, and celebrated achievements. Johnny stood near the edge of the room, his hands wrapped tightly around a glass of whiskey, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for something. Or someone. He spotted her in the center of it all, Margot. His wife. She was radiant tonight, as always. Her dark hair flowed elegantly over her shoulders, her smile lighting up her face as she engaged in animated conversations with their peers. She wore a sleek red gown, hugging her figure perfectly, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had recently climbed the ladder of success. Newly promoted to department manager, Margot was the evening's star, the center of attention in every circle she entered. But as Johnny watched her laugh and charm everyone around her, a sickening feeling gnawed at him. Johnny couldn't shake the cold suspicion that had taken root in his mind over the past few weeks. Margot had been different, distant, evasive. Her once affectionate demeanor had turned mechanical, and the small gestures that made their marriage feel solid had disappeared. The little things that once seemed insignificant had piled up, the late nights at work, the increased number of girls' nights out, the whispered phone calls. And then there was Frederick. Frederick was tall, charismatic, and a little too friendly with Margot. He worked in her department, and though Johnny had never liked the guy, he had chalked it up to simple dislike. Now, he wasn't so sure. He had caught them exchanging glances more than once, fleeting, but enough to send his mind spiraling. Tonight, those suspicions were coming to a head. Johnny took a sip of his whiskey, trying to steady himself. The alcohol burned down his throat, but it did little to quell the storm of emotions bubbling beneath his calm facade. He was a man known for his intelligence, his analytical mind. But emotionally, he kept things close, too close. He hated confrontation, despised the idea of causing a scene. Yet here he was, in the middle of a grand ballroom, watching his marriage unravel before his eyes. Margot's laughter rang out again, and Johnny's gaze sharpened. She was standing with Frederick now. The two of them stood slightly apart from the rest of the group, their conversation seeming more intimate. Frederick leaned in, saying something that made Margot giggle, a sound Johnny hadn't heard in their own home for what felt like ages. Then it happened. Frederick reached up and flicked something off his shoulder, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. But the smile that followed was unmistakable. It wasn't just a smile. It was a signal. Johnny's grip tightened around his glass until he thought it might shatter. The world around him faded, the noise of the room dulling as his focus zeroed in on that moment, that betrayal. In an instant, years of frustration and doubt surged to the surface, and before he could think it through, before the rational part of his mind could intervene, Johnny was moving. The ballroom blurred as he strode across the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. The sea of people parted around him, oblivious to the storm brewing in his eyes. Margot turned just as he reached them, her smile faltering when she saw the look on his face. But it was too late. Johnny swung. His fist connected with Frederick's jaw with a sickening thud, sending the man stumbling backward into the crowd. Gasps erupted from the surrounding guests, and in an instant, the room erupted into chaos. Frederick clutched his face, his expression twisted in shock and pain as he struggled to regain his balance. Margot's eyes widened, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at Johnny, disbelief and horror written all over her face. "Johnny," she cried, rushing to his side, her voice frantic. "What the hell are you doing?" But Johnny barely heard her. His eyes were locked on Frederick, on the man who had just confirmed every dark thought that had plagued him for weeks. The room swirled with shocked murmurs and hurried movements as people scrambled to intervene, to make sense of what had just happened. Margot grabbed Johnny's arm, pulling him away from the chaos. "What is wrong with you? Why did you?" she began, her voice shaky, but Johnny cut her off, his voice cold, quiet, and filled with years of pent-up emotion. "Not here," he said, his gaze hard. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares on him, but he didn't care. Not anymore. This wasn't something to be solved in front of a crowd. He needed answers. Now. Without another word, Johnny dragged Margot through the ballroom, ignoring the whispers and curious glances. The tension between them was palpable as they made their way to the hotel's balcony, a quiet space away from the prying eyes of their colleagues. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heated emotions swirling between them. Johnny let go of Margot's arm, stepping back to face her fully, his heart pounding in his chest. Margot crossed her arms, her face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You just punched Frederick in front of everyone. Have you lost your mind?" Johnny stared at her for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the effort to keep his composure. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and filled with an intensity that made Margot take a small step back. "I know," he said simply. Margot frowned. "Know what?" "I know about you and Frederick," Johnny replied, the words heavy with accusation. "I've seen the way you look at him, the way you laugh with him. And tonight? That little gesture he made? That was the last piece of the puzzle. You've been cheating on me, Margot." Margot's face paled, and for a split second, there was something in her eyes, fear, guilt, something. But she quickly recovered, shaking her head in disbelief. "Johnny, you're being ridiculous. You've got this all wrong." Johnny took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I've been watching you for weeks. Every late night at work, every excuse, every time you brushed me off. You think I haven't noticed the way you've been pulling away? The way you've been talking about me behind my back?" Margot opened her mouth to protest, but Johnny cut her off again, his frustration boiling over. "I'm done playing dumb, Margot. I want the truth." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Margot stared at him, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. For a moment, Johnny thought she might continue to deny it, to brush him off as paranoid. But then, something shifted in her expression. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Margot whispered, her voice barely audible. Johnny felt the weight of her words settle over him, confirming what he had feared all along. This was just the beginning of the truth that was about to unravel. The tension in the air was thick as Johnny and Margot stood on the balcony, the cold truth lingering between them. Margot's quiet confession had hit Johnny like a punch to the gut, but the rage simmering just beneath the surface hadn't abated. Instead, it had sharpened. He needed more than words. He needed to understand how things had spiraled this far out of control. Inside the ballroom, the crowd had likely moved on from the spectacle of the punch. But Johnny's world remained frozen in this moment, his marriage hanging by a thread. "What do you mean? You didn't mean for it to happen." Johnny's voice was icy, each word laced with betrayal. "You just accidentally fell into bed with Frederick?" Margot flinched but didn't back down. She squared her shoulders, her voice wavering but steady. "I'm not going to pretend that it was some big misunderstanding, Johnny. I made a mistake. A huge one. But it's not what you think. Not what I think." Johnny barked a bitter laugh. "So I imagine the way you two have been looking at each other? Imagine the distance between us for months?" Margot's eyes flashed with frustration, but before she could speak, the door to the balcony swung open. A few of their colleagues had stepped out to smoke, the smell of cigars wafting in the air, mixing with the crisp night breeze. Johnny barely spared them a glance before grabbing Margot's arm and pulling her toward the far end of the balcony, away from prying eyes. The confrontation wasn't going to end here. Just as they reached the quieter part of the balcony, the door opened again, and to Johnny's disbelief, Frederick walked out, holding a handkerchief to his jaw, his eyes scanning the area for them. His face was bruised from Johnny's punch, and the sight sent a fresh wave of fury through him. "What the hell do you want?" Johnny growled, stepping toward Frederick, his fists already clenched. Frederick, to his credit, didn't back down. His expression was hard, though the pain in his eyes betrayed the fact that Johnny's blow had done more than just physical damage. "I came out to talk," Frederick said, his voice steady, though he avoided Johnny's eyes. To explain. Explain? Johnny took a threatening step forward, his body tense. There's nothing to explain. You and my wife have been screwing behind my back, and you think you're going to explain your way out of it? Margot moved between them, her hands raised in a defensive gesture, trying to calm the situation. Johnny, stop. Just stop. This isn't going to fix anything. Fix anything? Johnny spat the words, his anger now mixing with the deep hurt he could barely contain. Do you hear yourself? You've been lying to me for God knows how long, and you want me to calm down? Frederick, still standing behind Margot, finally spoke up again. Johnny, listen. I'm not going to lie to you. What happened between Margot and me, it's wrong. I know that. But you need to know it wasn't like we were planning anything behind your back. Johnny's fist clenched so tight that he could feel his nails digging into his palm. You expect me to believe that? Margot interjected, her voice pleading now. Johnny, please. I made a mistake, yes. But I never stopped caring about you. I never. Never what? Johnny cut her off, his voice sharp. Never thought I'd find out? Never thought it would matter? He took a deep breath, his chest heaving as he tried to calm himself. The urge to punch Frederick again was almost overwhelming, but he knew it wouldn't solve anything. Not really. I want the truth, Margot, Johnny said, his voice softer now but no less intense. How long? Margot hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Frederick. It was all the confirmation Johnny needed. For God's sake, he muttered, turning away from her, his hands gripping the railing of the balcony as he tried to regain control. The city lights flickered in the distance, a cruel reminder that the world kept moving even when everything in his life had stopped. Behind him, Margot's voice was barely above a whisper. It started a few months ago. After my promotion. Johnny's body stiffened at the words. So this wasn't just some stupid fling. Margot swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. No, it wasn't. But it wasn't love either. It was a distraction. I felt. I don't know, lost. Trapped. And Frederick, he was there. He made me feel important again. The words stung, cutting deeper than Johnny thought they would. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Margot's mouth was different. It made everything real. So what now? Johnny asked, his voice hollow. Was this just going to keep going until I found out? Or were you planning on leaving me for him? Margot shook her head quickly, her voice desperate. No. I never planned to leave you, Johnny. It wasn't like that. Johnny turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Then what was it like, Margot? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like betrayal. Frederick stood awkwardly to the side, his presence only heightening the tension. Johnny knew he would have to deal with him eventually, but for now, all he cared about was hearing Margot admit the truth. All of it. Tell me, Johnny demanded, his eyes locking onto hers. I need to hear it from you. Margot's shoulders slumped, defeated. There was no escaping it anymore. I was unfaithful, Johnny. I betrayed you. And just like that, the final crack in their marriage split wide open. The silence between them was suffocating. Johnny stood on one side of the balcony, staring out into the night as if the answers to his questions could be found in the city's skyline. Margot stood opposite him, arms wrapped around herself, the weight of her admission pressing down like a boulder. Johnny's mind raced, replaying every moment of the last few months, every cold look, every late night, every excuse. He had tried so hard to ignore it, to convince himself that it was just stress, or the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But no. It had been something far more sinister all along. And now, there was no one learning that knowledge. Without warning, Johnny spun around, his voice sharp and cutting. Come with me. Margot blinked in surprise, not expecting the sudden command. Where? Just come, Johnny insisted, not waiting for her to follow as he strode across the balcony and into the quiet hallway beyond. Away from the prying eyes of their colleagues and Frederick's looming presence, Johnny needed answers, answers that he couldn't get in front of an audience. Margot hurried after him, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floors. Johnny led her down the corridor until they reached a set of double doors leading to a smaller, more secluded balcony. He shoved the doors open and stepped outside, the cool air hitting him in the face as Margot followed closely behind. "What is this?" Margot asked, crossing her arms defensively as the tension thickened between them. Johnny turned to face her, his eyes dark, his face set in a hard line. "I need you to explain. I want to know everything. Don't leave anything out." Margot took a deep breath, her gaze flickering away from Johnny's intense stare. "Johnny, I've already told you." "No," Johnny interrupted, stepping closer, his voice rising with each word. "I want details. I want to know how it started, why it started. Was it me? Did I do something to push you away? Or was this just your way of keeping yourself entertained?" Margot's mouth opened and closed, the guilt heavy in her eyes. She hadn't expected Johnny to demand this level of truth. Part of her had hoped that his anger would explode and then burn out, but this quiet, calculated rage was worse. Much worse. "It wasn't like that," Margot began, her voice soft but trembling. "At first, it was nothing. Just casual conversations at work. Frederick and he was someone I could talk to. You and we weren't connecting anymore, Johnny. You were so distant. I felt like I was disappearing." Johnny's jaw clenched as he listened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "And that justifies sleeping with him?" "No," Margot said quickly, shaking her head. "Of course not. But it wasn't planned. It just happened. One night, after a late meeting, we went out for drinks. One drink turned into two, and I don't know. We were talking, and I felt like someone was listening to me for the first time in months." Johnny's eyes narrowed, his voice bitter. "So that's all it took? A few drinks and some sweet words?" "It wasn't like that," Margot insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. And after that, I didn't know how to stop it." Johnny let out a harsh laugh, the sound filled with pain. "You didn't know how to stop it? Margot, you could have stopped it the moment it started. But instead, you chose to keep going. You chose him." Tears welled up in Margot's eyes as she stepped closer to Johnny, her hands reaching out to him, though she hesitated before touching him. "I didn't choose him, Johnny. I was lost, and I made a terrible mistake. I never stopped loving you." Johnny's expression twisted in disbelief. "You don't betray someone you love. You don't break them down and make them question everything they thought was real." Margot's hands dropped to her sides, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right. I can't undo what I did. I can't take back the pain I've caused you. But please, Johnny, try to understand." "Understand?" Johnny's voice rose, the dam of emotions threatening to burst. "You want me to understand how you lied to me for months? How you laughed in my face while sneaking around behind my back? How you've made me feel like a fool?" Margot flinched at the venom in his words, but she forced herself to stay composed. She couldn't fall apart now. Not when everything was already in pieces. "I was unhappy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I felt like I was suffocating in our marriage. I didn't know how to reach you anymore. And Frederick, he was just there." Johnny turned away, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain the storm inside him. He felt like he was drowning, pulled under by the weight of betrayal and the realization that the life he thought he had was nothing but a facade. "Did you ever plan to leave me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the vulnerability in his tone shocking even to him. Margot's breath hitched, and for a moment, she hesitated, her eyes searching Johnny's face for a sign of what he wanted to hear. "No," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I never planned to leave you. I wanted to fix things between us, but I didn't know how." Johnny shook his head slowly, his mind racing with memories of their life together, all the small moments that had led them here. Fix things, he repeated bitterly. You think you can fix this? Margot's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward, her voice breaking. Johnny, please. I'm begging you. We can still. No, Johnny said, his voice cold and final. We can't. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the enormity of what had happened settling over them like a heavy fog. The love they had shared, the life they had built, was now tainted by lies and betrayal. There was no going back. Margot wiped at her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. What are you going to do? Johnny looked at her, his gaze hard, his decision already made. You're going to tell them. Margot's brow furrowed in confusion. Tell who? Johnny stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. Our friends. Everyone you've lied to. You're going to tell them the truth. About the affair. About how you spread lies about me to cover your tracks. You're going to admit to everyone that you're the one who betrayed me. Margot's eyes widened in horror, her breath catching in her throat. Johnny, You owe me that much, Johnny said, his voice cold as ice. And if you won't do it, I will. Margot's hands trembled as she realized the gravity of Johnny's demand. The thought of standing in front of their friends, their colleagues, and confessing her betrayal made her stomach churn. But she knew she had no choice. Johnny was done with her lies, and there was no hiding from the consequences anymore. With tears streaming down her face, Margot nodded, her voice broken. Okay. I'll do it. Johnny didn't respond. He simply turned away, leaving Margot standing alone on the balcony, the weight of her choices crashing down on her like a tidal wave. The air between Johnny and Margot felt heavier than ever, the silence after her confession stretching unbearably. Margot's agreement to come clean to their friends had momentarily satisfied Johnny's need for justice, but now the reality of their situation settled in like a vice around his chest. He had forced the truth out of her, but the betrayal still stung, deep and raw. Every word she had spoken replayed in his mind, and with each thought, his anger cooled into something much more dangerous, cold calculation. Johnny leaned against the balcony railing, his eyes scanning the glittering city below. His mind was a whirlwind, but he was done with the yelling, the dramatic scenes. He needed clarity, control. He glanced back at Margot, who stood a few feet away, wiping her eyes, her once confident posture now collapsed into defeat. She looked so small now, broken down from the weight of her guilt. Tell me, Johnny said quietly, his voice devoid of the fire it had held earlier, how long has this been going on? Margot swallowed, her throat tight. It started a few months after my promotion, she admitted, her voice hoarse. It wasn't supposed to turn into what it became. I didn't mean for it to happen, Johnny. How long? Johnny repeated, his gaze unrelenting. Margot looked away, her hands trembling. 6 months. Maybe more. I don't know. The words hit Johnny like a hammer to the chest. 6 months. Half a year of lies, deceit, and betrayal. He thought about all the moments he had missed the signs, all the times he had brushed off his suspicions as paranoia. Now, the truth was laid bare, and it made him feel sick. And what about him? Johnny asked, his voice colder. Did you love him? Margot's head shot up, her eyes wide with shock. No, she said quickly, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. I didn't love him. It was an escape. I felt trapped in our marriage, and Frederick, he was just there. Johnny let out a bitter laugh, turning away from her again. Just there, he muttered under his breath. And you thought that was enough reason to throw everything away? Margot stepped closer, her voice pleading now. Johnny, I know I've hurt you. I know I've made terrible mistakes. But I never stopped caring about you. This wasn't about you. Johnny's jaw clenched, and he spun around to face her. Not about me, he echoed, his voice rising again. How could it not be about me, Margot? You betrayed me. You made me look like a fool. Don't stand there and tell me this wasn't about me. Margot flinched at his words, tears welling up in her eyes once more. I was scared, Johnny. I was scared of losing myself, of losing what we had. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. Every time I tried, it felt like you weren't there. Johnny's eyes narrowed, the bitterness in his voice palpable. So instead of talking to me, you decided to talk to him. To find comfort in someone else. Margot's voice broke, her tears spilling over. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I can't take back what I've done. But I need you to understand, Johnny, I didn't want this to end like this. Johnny shook his head, his emotions in turmoil. He could see the regret in her eyes, the guilt etched across her face, but it wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies could erase the betrayal that had shattered their marriage. As Margot continued to speak, Johnny's thoughts turned inward. Despite everything, he couldn't help but wonder if he was partly to blame. Had he been too distant? Too emotionally unavailable? He had always prided himself on being calm and composed, but had that turned him into someone unapproachable? Someone Margot felt she couldn't confide in? The questions gnawed at him, but before he could fully confront them, Margot's voice interrupted his thoughts. I never loved Frederick, she said again, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. I was looking for something, but it wasn't love. It was just a way to feel alive again. Johnny's heart twisted at her words. He understood, in some twisted way, what she meant. He had felt the distance between them too, but he had never imagined it would lead to this. And now what? Johnny asked, his voice quieter but still filled with hurt. What were you going to do? Keep going like nothing was wrong? Keep lying to me? Margot's shoulders slumped as she shook her head. No. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to stop, but I didn't know how to fix what I had broken. I was scared you'd leave me if you found out. Johnny let out a bitter chuckle. Leave you? After everything you've done, Margot, I don't know how I could stay. Margot's breath hitched, and she stepped forward, desperation in her eyes. Johnny, please. I'm begging you. Don't make any decisions right now. We can figure this out. We can try to fix this. Johnny stared at her, his expression hard. He wasn't sure if there was anything left to fix. His trust in her was shattered, and without that, what was left? I'm not the one who has to fix anything, Johnny said, his voice firm. You broke us. You betrayed everything we had. Margot's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. Johnny watched her for a moment, his heart aching despite his anger. A part of him wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her that everything would be okay. But he couldn't. Not anymore. As Margot cried, Johnny felt the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy burden. He knew their marriage couldn't survive this. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too broken. But walking away wouldn't be easy either. They had built a life together, a family, and tearing that apart would leave scars on both of them. Taking a deep breath, Johnny stepped closer to Margot, his voice quiet but resolute. This is over, Margot. There's no coming back from this. Margot's sobs grew louder, but Johnny didn't waver. He had made his decision, and now there was no turning back. The finality of Johnny's words echoed in the air between them, leaving Margot sobbing and broken. But Johnny wasn't done. The betrayal had cut too deep, and though he'd decided their marriage was over, he wasn't going to let Margot walk away without facing the full weight of her actions. He needed her to own up to everything, not just in private, but in front of everyone she'd lied to. Johnny stepped forward, his face cold and determined. You're not going to get away with just admitting this to me, he said, his voice low but filled with purpose. I want you to tell everyone. Our friends, your colleagues, everyone who's heard the lies you've spread about me. Margot looked up at him through her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with fear. Johnny, please, she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. I already told you the truth. Isn't that enough? Enough? Johnny's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. You made me out to be a joke, Margot. You painted me as the cold, distant husband so you could justify your affair. You think telling me the truth in private makes up for that? No. You're going to admit to everyone what you did." Margot shook her head, panic flashing across her face. "Johnny, please don't do this. You don't understand how humiliating that will be." "I don't care," Johnny replied, his voice sharp. "I'm not letting you walk away with your reputation intact while I'm left looking like the villain. You're going to tell them all the truth. Every last bit of it." Margot's breath quickened as the full weight of Johnny's demand sank in. She knew she had no choice. Johnny wasn't bluffing, and if she refused, he'd find a way to expose her lies himself. The thought of standing in front of their friends and colleagues, confessing her betrayal, made her stomach churn. But there was no way out. With a shaky breath, Margot nodded. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll tell them." Johnny's expression didn't soften. He stepped back, watching her with cold detachment. "Good. You can start tonight." "Tonight?" Margot's voice cracked in disbelief. "Johnny, it's already late." "Everyone's still here," Johnny interrupted. "They're in the ballroom, still talking about the punch I threw at Frederick. You've got the perfect audience. Let's go." Margot's legs felt weak beneath her, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. But Johnny was relentless, his resolve unshakable. With trembling hands, she wiped her face, trying to gather whatever composure she could muster. There was no escaping this. She had brought this upon herself, and now she had to face the consequences. Johnny didn't wait for her to catch up. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom, his footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. Margot followed slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, dread settling deep in her stomach. As they approached the grand doors of the ballroom, the murmur of conversation grew louder, and Margot felt a fresh wave of nausea. Johnny pushed open the doors, stepping inside without hesitation. The atmosphere was still lively, though there was an undercurrent of tension after the earlier altercation. People glanced at Johnny as he entered, their eyes flickering with curiosity and confusion. Margot trailed behind him, feeling every stare like a dagger. Johnny walked to the center of the room, and without missing a beat, he spoke, his voice loud and clear. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" The room fell silent almost immediately, all eyes turning to Johnny. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, but there was a fierce intensity in his eyes. Margot stood frozen behind him, her pulse racing, knowing what was coming. "I know you all saw what happened earlier," Johnny began, his voice steady. "And I'm sure you've all got questions. So let me clear things up. The reason I hit Frederick tonight wasn't because of some misunderstanding. It was because he's been sleeping with my wife." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Margot felt her legs nearly give out beneath her. The humiliation was overwhelming, but Johnny wasn't done. "Margot's been having an affair for months," Johnny continued, his voice unwavering. "And during that time, she's been lying to all of you. Telling stories about how I've been a distant, uncaring husband to justify what she's been doing behind my back. Well, tonight, I'm here to set the record straight." He turned to Margot, his eyes cold. "Go ahead. Tell them." Margot's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. The room was deathly quiet, every pair of eyes fixed on her. She could feel the judgment, the shock, the disgust. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear from this moment, but there was no escape. With trembling hands, she stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's true," she said, her voice shaky. "I've been unfaithful to Johnny. I've lied to all of you about our marriage, and I've betrayed him." The weight of her confession hung in the air, the silence deafening. Margot couldn't bring herself to look up, couldn't bear to see the faces of the people she had deceived. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly defeated. Johnny didn't wait for her to continue. He had gotten what he wanted. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Margot standing alone in front of their stunned colleagues. As Johnny walked away from the ballroom, the noise of the stunned crowd faded into a dull hum behind him. His footsteps echoed in the grand hallway, the tension and adrenaline that had driven him through the confrontation finally beginning to ebb. He felt a strange sense of calm settling over him, though the raw pain of betrayal still gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He didn't look back at Margot. He couldn't. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, now felt like a stranger. She had stood in front of everyone, broken and humiliated, but Johnny wasn't sure if it was enough to dull the sting of what she had done. Part of him felt hollow, as if the emotional battle had drained him of everything. The other part felt liberated. There was no longer any need to pretend, to keep up appearances. The facade was shattered. As he reached the hotel's entrance, the cool night air hit him, clearing his head. He paused at the door, glancing around as the city moved on around him. Cars passed by on the street, people hurried along the sidewalk, unaware of the personal war that had just erupted inside the ballroom. Life, as always, went on, indifferent to his turmoil. For the first time in what felt like forever, Johnny allowed himself to breathe. He closed his eyes, the sharp city breeze tugging at his jacket as he tried to absorb the reality of what had just transpired. It was over. He had ripped the truth out into the open, and now there was no going back. Yet even as he stood there, alone beneath the night sky, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. What came next? What did life look like after this? Johnny had spent so much time obsessing over Margot's betrayal, collecting every clue, piecing together the puzzle of her affair. Now that the truth was out, he realized he had no idea how to move forward. Back inside the hotel, the murmurs of disbelief and shock still lingered in the ballroom. Margot remained rooted to the spot where Johnny had left her. Her face pale, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, their judgment palpable, suffocating. She tried to speak, tried to say something, anything, to soften the blow, but the words wouldn't come. The guilt was too overwhelming. The humiliation too complete. There was no recovering from this. She had confessed in front of everyone she respected, everyone who had once admired her for her success and charm. Now, she stood there, exposed and broken, with nothing left but the consequences of her actions. Frederick, standing awkwardly near the back of the crowd, made no move to come to her aid. He looked just as shocked and horrified as everyone else, his bruised jaw still throbbing from Johnny's punch. Whatever connection they had shared was severed now, destroyed by the force of the truth. In that moment, Margot realized just how alone she truly was. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to break down further in front of everyone. With shaky hands, she straightened her dress and began walking toward the exit, her head bowed in shame. She could hear the whispers following her, could feel the cold glares of her colleagues burning into her back, but she didn't stop. There was no point. She couldn't face them, not after this. As she stepped out into the night, the cool air hit her, but it brought no comfort. Margot glanced down the street and saw Johnny standing near the curb, lighting a cigar, the one she had given him on their last anniversary. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. The chasm between them was too deep now, too wide to bridge. Margot took a deep breath, her heart heavy with regret. She knew, in that moment, that whatever they had shared, whatever love had once bound them together, was truly gone. She had destroyed it, and now there was nothing left but the pieces of their broken marriage. Johnny exhaled a cloud of smoke, watching it dissipate into the night sky. His mind was already drifting toward the future, toward the inevitable conversations about divorce, custody arrangements for their daughter, Bethy, and the long, painful road ahead. He wasn't sure if he could ever trust again, wasn't sure if he could rebuild after this. But one thing was clear, he had made his choice. There was no going back. As Margot walked past him, her eyes downcast, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was louder than any argument, heavier than any words they could exchange. It was the silence of finality, of an ending that couldn't be undone. And so, with the night stretching out before them, Johnny and Margot walked away from the wreckage of their marriage, each carrying their own weight of betrayal, guilt, and regret. In the days that followed, the silence between Johnny and Margot became permanent. The reality of their broken marriage settled in like an unwelcome guest that neither of them could ignore. Johnny moved out of their home, taking only what he needed, while Margot remained in the house they had shared, now empty of the life they had once built together. The legal proceedings were swift. Johnny had made it clear from the beginning that there was no reconciliation to be found. They agreed on shared custody of Bethy, their young daughter, the only person whose life Johnny truly worried about now. He resolved to be the best father he could be for her, even as his relationship with Margot crumbled into ashes. Bethy deserved more than the mess their marriage had become, and Johnny was determined to shield her from the worst of it. As for Margot, she kept her word. True to Johnny's ultimatum, she admitted the affair to their close friends, their social circle, and even to her colleagues at work. The humiliation was excruciating, but she bore it without complaint, knowing it was the least she owed Johnny for the pain she had caused. Word spread quickly, and soon, Margot found herself more isolated than ever, her once bright career dimming under the weight of the scandal. But despite the judgment and whispers, she accepted it as part of the price she had to pay. For Johnny, the immediate aftermath of the divorce was a strange mix of relief and sadness. He no longer had to wonder, to suspect, to live in the shadow of Margot's betrayal. But the emptiness left behind was undeniable. The home they had shared, the memories they had created, it was all tainted now, irrevocably. He tried to focus on work, on spending time with Bethy, but the quiet moments alone were the hardest. It was then that the full weight of what had been lost hit him the hardest. One evening, after another long day at the office, Johnny found himself standing outside the very hotel where everything had come crashing down. The memory of that night, of the confrontation with Margot and Frederick, still lingered in the back of his mind, but tonight, it felt distant, like a storm that had finally passed. He lit another cigar, the last one from the box Margot had given him. He had been saving it, though he wasn't sure why. Now, as the smoke curled up into the cool night air, he realized it symbolized the closing of a chapter. Johnny took a slow drag from the cigar, his thoughts drifting. The sting of Margot's betrayal would likely never fade completely, but the bitterness was beginning to soften. He knew he couldn't dwell on the past forever. Life, as relentless as it was, moved forward. And so would he. He thought of Bethy, her laughter, her innocent questions about why things were changing. Johnny knew he had to be strong for her, to show her that even when things fall apart, they can be rebuilt. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. He wasn't sure what the future held, whether he would ever open himself up to love again, whether he could ever fully trust someone, but for now, that didn't matter. As the city lights flickered around him, Johnny felt a small, tentative sense of hope. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer consumed him. He had survived the worst of it, and now, he was ready to rebuild, on his own terms, in his own time. He finished the cigar, tossing the last remnants into the street. With one final glance at the hotel, Johnny hailed a cab and climbed in, watching the city blur by as he drove toward an uncertain but promising future. Life would go on. And so would he.